Hello, I'm Lisa Tepper-Bates, the teaching fellow from the School of Management in the Faith and Globalization course, and I have the honor to be here today with Professor H.L. Seneviratne from the University of Virginia, Department of Anthropology. Welcome, Professor. Thank you for being with us today.
Thank you for having me.
As we've discussed this week in Faith and Globalization, we have been talking about conflicts in which religion plays a role. And we are very pleased to have you here today as a resource to help us understand the role that Buddhism has to play in the conflict in Sri Lanka. I'd like to ask you a very general question to start with, and that is an overview, if you would provide one, of the way that Buddhism has played a role in the conflict in your country.
Sure. I think the most important thing to remember when we contemplate this question is that Buddhism is not one thing, and we really have no way of knowing exactly what the Buddha said historically or linguistically, but we can logically, I think, come to some sort of reasonable conclusion. And the Buddha's message is very simply that there is a problem, there is a reason for it, and there is a way out, and he outlined the way out. And there's no more to Buddhism than that. And it has been, of course, institutionalized in very different ways in different countries. And to make this short, in Sri Lanka itself, which is a small country, Buddhism is not one thing. The kind of Buddhism that we might imagine was the Buddha's own Buddhism is practiced only by a very, very few individuals, if any at all. Most of the time, Buddhism is a popular religion. It has integrated itself into the pre-existing beliefs of the country and borrowed also religious ideas and religious beings to worship from Hinduism. And this is one aspect which we might call the strictly sort of religious aspect of Buddhism. But then it has a political aspect. There has been, going back to at least 1500 years ago, there is a national chronicle in Sri Lanka called the Mahavansa, which means a great genealogy, which is a religious history of the country, of the kings. And in the Mahavansa, there is this myth of colonization of the country, and there's a very clear notion of an ideal society there. And that ideal society, the island of Sri Lanka, belongs to the exclusively to the Sinhala people, and it is the well-being of the country depends on the moral behavior of the people, and in the sense of a morality derived from Buddhism. So long as people behave morally, everything is fine, and therefore it is the responsibility of the government, of the king, to make sure that Buddhism is protected and nourished. And so this is a completely, it's a commitment, it's inviolable. No king can really abandon this. So that is how you get this other kind of, it's a third kind of Buddhism, is a political Buddhism. Mm-hmm. It is that Buddhism that is causing the problems, not the Buddha's own doctrine.
I see. And can you comment then on the Western understanding of Buddhism, which we, I think, understand very simplistically perhaps that peace is perhaps the most central value in Buddhism. Yeah. Now, how do we put that concept, if that is in fact correct, together with the political Buddhism that we see at work in Sri Lanka?
Well, I think one way to look at this is every religion has the message of peace. I don't think there's any religion that advocates violence. And Buddhism in particular has been associated with peace, and people think this is the religion, the great religion of universal compassion. And this is, of course, partly derived from Buddhism, but partly also I think, part of the clever propaganda on the part of the Buddhists. So, like for example, the Dalai Lama we associate with peace, and particularly in this country, I think again Buddhism is very varied, but one of the dominant strands of Buddhism in this country is precisely the Mahayana Buddhism, which is one aspect which is, I think, characterized by the Dalai Lama and his teachings. And when you get to the question of how Buddhism and peace can be, Buddhism can be employed in the service of peace, that's a very difficult question, because it also has a very important general dimension. You can have all kinds of nice ideas, but the question is, how do we translate this into action? As I said before, every religion has good ideas. There's no religion that advocates killing, but it is a question of how a religion and its moral ideas are going to be translated into practice. I think it was a great insight of Max Weber in his very famous book called The Protestant Ethic and the Spirit of Capitalism, that he was able to demonstrate a series of relations between a set of religious ideas and capitalism. And there is a general sort of simplistic understanding of this book as Weber having said religion causes capitalism. He didn't say that. He posited a series of relations that are interconnected and sort of causally connected, and thereby demonstrated how a religious idea could become a very secular idea. And so I think if we are to use religion in bringing about peace, we will have to think of some kind of mechanism like that, some way of effectively translating these beliefs, because I think in some ways we can think of it in the reverse of Weber's. If the economy is doing well, I think peace is easier. It is only when economic conditions deteriorate and there's not enough to go around, then all kinds of other ideas can be used to point at enemies, and then generally it is not a very happy state of affairs.
Well, that's right, and that's a very interesting point you make, which gets to some of the very complicated issues regarding how religion plays a role as part of identity as opposed to a force unto itself. And can you speak to, in the case of Sri Lanka, do you think that there is some sort of inevitability about the violent conflict because of the mythology or the national belief about the origin of the people and the right of the Sinhala people that is special above others in Sri Lanka? Does that necessarily bring us to conflict?
I would again go back to what I just said. I think the ideology would have survived anyway, but I think the reason why it has become the basis of the conflict is precisely because of lack of development in the economy. Had the country prospered and there were enough jobs and enough access to education and opportunities, I think people would have forgotten these. You could nurture all kinds of fantasies about your own identity, and still they can be quite harmless. And in fact, I'm in some ways talking through experience, because I do recall in my personal experience a period of time in Sri Lankan history that it was somewhat like that, although it was not, there was never any kind of overwhelming prosperity. But there was a system of society just before and after the British occupation. Actually, people do not, I think, adequately differentiate between when we talk about imperialism, colonialism. They don't adequately distinguish between the various stages of colonialism. It is, of course, completely correct that during the early years of British rule, they committed atrocities, But then towards the latter, when you get to late imperialism, late colonialism, I think the liberal humane ideas that were also growing in England had an effect on the colonial government, and they introduced parliamentary institutions, the rule of law, and notions like human rights and various kinds of modern ideas, and not to mention modern institutions. So the country was actually, there was a certain kind of civility. Strangely enough, it's a kind of civility that you would suppose that would develop under ideal Buddhist conditions. So I, in fact, feel that the Protestant Reformation brought about a kind of a Buddhist spirit, as much as I suppose whatever Max Weber and others would have meant by what they were arguing about. So I think in the case of the Buddhist identity, it could have remained perfectly, integral to the society without ever really becoming an antisocial force.
That's a very interesting perspective. Now, on a similar note, let me ask you this then. There are different theories of history, and there are some that would argue that the directions that history takes are very much dependent on historical forces, and then there's another school of thought that would argue that individual leaders shape everything. So could I ask for your thoughts on why it is that in some situations, perhaps in India with the rise of Mahatma Gandhi, or in the United States when Martin Luther King became an important leader, how do we understand the forces that allow us to draw on the most positive that our religions have to offer, as opposed to situations in which more negative and destructive aspects of the religion are drawn out? Do you have some thoughts on that to share?
Well, about the first part of your question, that whether it is the individual or the larger movement history, in some ways I suppose it's a little bit of both. And in Sri Lanka there is, I think your question is very relevant to Sri Lanka, in the sense that there is a very powerful personality. His name is Dharmapala, and it is prefixed by the term Anagarika. Anagarika means homeless. And this man was, he called himself homeless because he didn't want to become a Buddhist monk. Buddhist monks are traditionally described as homeless, meaning they have given up their belongings and their homes and family life and so on. But he didn't want to be a Buddhist monk, because had he become a Buddhist monk, he thought he would not be able to do the kinds of things that he wanted to do for the society. Therefore, he remained a layman, but he remained celibate, so he called him as homeless Dharmapala. So, but the paradox about him is that he was trained in Christian missionary schools in the early period of British rule, and in the late 19th century and early 20th century. And one of the problems of missionary Christianity in probably all over the world, but certainly I know from Sri Lankan experience, is the insensitivity of the missionaries to the local people and the cultures, because it is not the case that the people didn't like Christianity. It is they didn't like the way it was thrust on them. So this man, when he was young in Protestant Christian school, the Christian fathers, who were the priests, who were teachers, he felt humiliated by the kinds of things they said about Sri Lanka and Buddhism. So obviously a gifted child, he had this thing inside him. And when he later on, as a young man, got to understand more about his own culture and Buddhism, he became a radical critique of Christianity, and in some ways it also had a bad effect on him, in the sense that his creativity was somewhat sort of channeled in the direction of bitterness and sense of frustration and so on. So he became very xenophobic in a way, and it was he who really gave a renewed kind of validation to the ancient myth that I just talked about a little while ago about the exclusivity of the ownership of the island by the Sinhala Buddhists. This notion and the obligation of the Sinhala Buddhist people to protect Buddhism and then make it the most forceful thing in society, and this theory was given an enormous boost by the work of Dharmapala, and I think that defined the particular turn the Buddhist movement took in Sri Lanka, which unfortunately has had severe consequences.
I see. And what do you think it would take at this moment where we see that events in Sri Lanka recently have been so terribly negative? What would it take, or what could be done to try in this difficult situation to draw out the reconciliation and peace that is present in a different strand of Buddhism? Or is that possible at this juncture?
Well, I think it is possible, and we need to approach it not so much directly from a religious point of view, but it has to, I think, take a much broader kind of view. And to begin with, the government's approach is a military solution to the civil war. Now, I don't think that is going to work. I think it's very important that the central grievances that underlie the problem be addressed, which would be actually devolution of power to the minorities. It is part of the traditional political Buddhist belief that this country is one, and so any kind of devolution of power is anathema to them. So I think therefore it is important that that either religious leaders or political leaders exert some influence on so that convey their ideas about the country, the need to somehow accommodate minorities and come up with an effective set of proposals for devolution. And that's the kind of larger political question. But in general, excuse me, there has been a different kind of problem. There has been a decline in the social order in general, the breakdown of law and order, and compromising of parliamentary institutions, human rights violations, and not to mention also complete disarray in the public arena of, for example, the administrative structures. Mm-hmm. And there's been a general disintegration of the social order. I think for this to be corrected, it is very important that institutions of the society, particularly of the government, like the major divisions like the legislature, the judiciary, and the executive, these should have their independence, and they should each, in other words, the politicization of everything that we see today needs to be corrected. And already there is legislation for it. It's called the 17th Amendment. It's in the Constitution. As it is, for example, supposing some kind of crime is committed and the police start investigations, then a politician will interfere and say, don't do this because this is my friend. And that's a very simplified example, but this kind of thing happening all the time. The government has politicized everything. So the 17th Amendment is an attempt to depoliticize, to give independence to the media, to the police, the judiciary, the administrative system. For example, the senior public servants of the senior administrative service cannot make administrative decisions because the politicians interfere. And so this has been really destructive of the public interest. So I think parallel to the search for a peace through devolution, there should also be mechanisms in the broader social order. In particular, there should be an attempt to put into effect the 17th Amendment. In fact, the fact that the amendment has been there but has not been put into effect is also illustrative of Sri Lanka's problem, that there are good intentions, but they are not followed through. And so we'll have to think of some way of effecting that follow through. And one possibility is that religious leaders might be able to exert some pressure, and it should be understood not so much as some kind of sectarian thing. There should be some unity, some kind of I think communication not only within the within the different Buddhist divisions, but also among religions. I think if the religious leadership of all the major religions, and there are 4 major religions represented in Sri Lanka: Buddhism, Christianity, Hinduism and Islam. If all these people can get together and exert, and in fact it need not be confined to them, there is also, interestingly enough, civil society in Sri Lanka which is very quite admirable. They have independently and through against all odds had been expressing their views and coming up with extremely civilized ideas about society. And so if we can imagine some sort of civil society movement of both the clergy of all the religions and these intellectuals and other people who are committed to certain kind of social values, I think something can be done.
And do you see local Buddhist leaders who you believe will take up that call?
Unfortunately, the Buddhist leadership itself is very partisan, and they are themselves they have not shown themselves to be capable of objectively understand this paradigm of the myth of political Buddhism and its historical nature and its relation to the economy, that kind of thing. They have not been able to understand, and therefore the Buddhist leadership itself has been rather disappointing. But that is not to say there are no individual members in that leadership. There are some. I think those people will have to talk to other people, other leaders of religions, plus I think civil society leaders in the secular society.
And do you believe there's a role, you noted earlier in our discussion, that the Dalai Lama has taken a position in his interpretation of Buddhism that is different than the prevailing Buddhist theology in Sri Lanka? Do you think that other leaders like the Dalai Lama from other parts of the Buddhist world could play a role in Sri Lanka?
Well, conceivably, but I think it is probably better if the initiative comes from within the country, because there is a lot of popular xenophobia, and there is a distrust of the foreigners, and so I think in fact the case of Dalai Lama is a very interesting case, because I have participated in discussions like this in different parts of this country, in Washington DC and other places, and the question has come up over and over again: why cannot Sri Lanka invite the Dalai Lama? Now that's a very big problem, because the Dalai Lama represents what we call the Mahayana Buddhism, and Sri Lanka is a Theravada Buddhist country. These are 2 major divisions in Buddhism, and the Sri Lankan Buddhist hierarchy would be very opposed to the idea of the Dalai Lama making any being invited to do anything, and therefore he will not, although the Dalai Lama has enormous prestige in the West, he does not command the same kind of prestige in Sri Lanka.
I see. Then returning to the question of a resolution drawing on the positive forces of religion from within Sri Lanka, how would you describe the obligations that a committed Buddhist in Sri Lanka who disagrees with this prevailing radical and violent interpretation of Buddhist responsibilities, how should such a person see their responsibility in Sri Lanka?
I think they should support the civil society efforts to bring about not only a narrowly conceived solution to the present civil war, but the general problem. I think there's a general malaise, and that is really the problem. I think even civil war is a manifestation or an expression of this general problem, and the way to address it, as I said, is the putting into effect the 17th Amendment to the Constitution. And I think the community leaders that you have in mind could, if they can somehow communicate with each other and form themselves into some effective force, and then join hands with these religious leaders and others, civil society leaders, that is the way an individual, I think, could help.
I see. And can I ask, on that note, it seems that throughout our discussion we're returning to the theme that what is really needed to establish peace in Sri Lanka is work on the government and the public policy side from a number of aspects, with religion as part of that, part of the background perhaps. But what we seem to be saying is that it's not a religious dialogue as such that will actually help to overcome this conflict. Is that fair to summarize?
Yes, I think that would be, because it is not to begin with anything to do with religious ideas per se. It is nothing to do with spiritual and moral system at all. It is much more to do with the politicization, political Buddhism. And for example, in the early Mahavansa account, the king, before going to war, says, this is not a fight for my glory. This is for, I'm fighting for Buddhism. Mm-hmm. And this should sound rather familiar to you in this election season, because the king is saying, religion first, me second. You know.
That's right. That's right. Absolutely. And what lessons do you think, if any, this approach that we're talking about to resolve the situation in Sri Lanka, what lessons does that provide for other conflicts in which religion plays a role? Or would you rather argue that each one should be looked at separately?
Definitely each one should be looked at separately, but I would suspect from a general sociological point of view that it needs to be addressed in a kind of a totalistic way. I would also suspect, just like in Sri Lanka, there are forces outside the sphere of religion itself that are very crucial in the creation, in the etiology of these conflicts, and they should be addressed.
I see. Well, thank you very much for your thoughts, and thank you for coming to speak with the students in Faith and Globalization today.
Thank you very much. Very nice to be here.